Imagine this. The year is 1847. The wind howls across the endless prairie, sweeping dust into your eyes until they burn. Behind you, the life you knew, farms, small towns, crowded cities, shrinks to memory. Ahead of you lie 6 months of misery, uncertainty, and danger, all of it balanced on the fragile wooden wheels of a covered wagon. They called it adventure. They called it destiny. But for those who lived it, this was a slow march into something far darker, something closer to survival than to the shining dream of freedom. We've all seen the stories: smiling families rolling across golden fields, brave men with rifles perched on their wagons, women gazing across the horizon with quiet resolve. Hollywood sold us a romance, but reality was a bone-breaking, soul-crushing test of human endurance. The trail was no noble quest. It was an open wound stretching thousands of miles, littered with broken wagons, animal bones, shallow graves, and dreams that never made it past the first 100 miles. Tonight, I'll take you there, to the rattling wagons, the choking dust, and the long shadow of death that followed every step. These are not just facts, these are brutal truths about traveling the Old West in a covered wagon. The first truth strikes like a hammer. Time itself was the enemy. Imagine beginning in St. Louis, with San Francisco shimmering like a promise on the far horizon. On a good day, your wagon might travel 20 miles, but most days weren't good. Rough terrain, sudden storms, livestock collapsing under the yoke. You were lucky to crawl 8 to 10 miles before exhaustion forced you to stop. On paper, the journey might take 90 days. In reality, it stretched to half a year. 6 months of bone deep fatigue, 6 months of rising with the dawn and collapsing in the dirt long after sunset. 6 months of watching the seasons shift as if time itself mocked you. Think about it. Half a year with no escape, no rest, no familiar comforts. Every sunrise brought not relief, but another reminder of how far you still had to go. And if you were sick, if you twisted an ankle, if you lost a wheel, you didn't pause. You endured. Because falling behind didn't mean delay, it meant death. And what of the wagons themselves? They were no carriages of comfort. Forget cushioned seats. Forget suspension. The prairie schooner, with its curved bows and canvas stretched taut, was a wooden box mounted on wheels that never forgave. Each rut in the road, each stone buried in the mud, sent shocks through the entire frame. Imagine sitting in a coffin that someone is shaking with violent hands for 12 hours a day. That was life inside the wagon, and it was so unbearable, so brutal, that most people didn't even ride. They walked, mile after mile, through blistering sun and biting wind. Families trudged beside their wagons, like prisoners chained to a punishment they had chosen. To sit meant bruises. To walk meant exhaustion. There was no winning, only surviving. Night brought no sanctuary. When darkness fell across the prairie, the wagons offered no comfort. Their cramped interiors were crammed with possessions: food, tools, clothing, fragile keepsakes from lives left behind. Families couldn't sleep inside. Instead, they lay under thin blankets on the cold ground, exposed to the whistling winds, to the sudden pelting of rain, to the sharp bite of frost. On summer nights, the earth baked their bodies with lingering heat. On winter nights, the ground itself seemed to drain the warmth from their blood. Sleep was shallow, haunted by hunger, thirst, and the ache in their bones. The mornings were worse. Rising with stiff muscles, sore backs, and chapped skin, they trudged back into the same misery as yesterday. Imagine doing this not for a week, not for a month, but for half a year. The psychological toll was just as brutal as the physical one. Each day blended into the next until time became a kind of purgatory, a march with no guarantee of redemption at the end. But humans can endure hunger and exhaustion if the promise of food lies ahead. What if that food was little more than beans, bacon, and biscuits cooked over a fire, fueled not by wood, but by dried cow dung? Out on the treeless prairie, wood was scarce. Families gathered piles of desiccated cow chips, stacking them like treasure. They burned slowly, with a bitter smoke that clung to your clothes and hair, yet they were the difference between eating and starving. Dinner was not a feast. It was survival. Beans boiled in soot, hard biscuits that cracked teeth, salted pork that grew rancid under the sun. And if the livestock weakened, the meals grew even scarcer. Hunger followed the pioneers like a wolf just outside the circle of firelight, waiting for its chance. And what of the animals pulling these wagons? Popular imagination tells us it was horses, sleek and noble. The truth is far less glamorous. Horses were too costly, too fragile for such a brutal trek. Instead, pioneers relied on oxen and mules. Oxen, slow, stubborn, but impossibly strong, dragged the heavy wagons across rivers, mountains, and plains. Their hooves cracked on the rocky trails. Their hides grew raw under the yoke. They were beasts of burden in every sense, and without them, the wagons would never have moved. Families whispered prayers not only for their children, but for their oxen, because if the animals failed, the journey was already lost. Even the wagon's canvas covers, those iconic white arches glowing in the sun, offered little protection. The canvas had to be treated with linseed oil just to keep out the rain, and even then, it was no fortress. Wind drove dust beneath the flaps, coating everything in a fine, choking layer. Rain came sideways, soaking clothes and bedding. At night, the canvas snapped in the wind, a flimsy barrier against the elements. And when storms raged across the plains, lightning seared the sky, and wagons seemed nothing more than fragile tinder boxes, one strike away from obliteration. And when something broke, and it always did, families faced the terror of isolation. Imagine being miles from any town, any help, and hearing the sharp crack of an axle snapping. The wagon shudders to a halt. There is no blacksmith, no mechanic, no one to call. Repairs had to be made with what you carried or what you could scavenge from the wilderness. A tree branch cut into shape, a strip of rawhide twisted into rope. The work was exhausting, the pressure unbearable, because if you could not repair it, the train might leave you behind. And in the vast emptiness of the prairie, being left behind was a sentence as final as any gallows. But the trail held dangers beyond the wagons themselves. At some point, every family faced the dark, rushing water of rivers. Ferries existed, but were costly, and most couldn't afford the luxury. Instead, they forded. Wagons were sealed with wax, transformed into flimsy boats, and driven into the currents. Children clung to their mothers. As water surged around them, oxen strained against the weight. Wheels shuddered beneath the waves. One slip, one moment of imbalance, and everything, provisions, possessions, lives, was swallowed by the river. Many didn't make it across. For those who did, relief was always tempered by the knowledge that the next crossing might be worse. And still, the greatest enemy wasn't rivers, storms, or broken wagons. It was the invisible plague that crept among them. Disease, cholera spread like wildfire, carried by tainted water. One day, a man might seem healthy, if weary. The next, he was gone, buried in a shallow grave by the trail. Diphtheria struck children with cruel efficiency, their small bodies powerless against its grip. Dysentery, malaria, scurvy, fevers of every kind. Illness was a constant drumbeat, a reminder that at any moment the trail could claim another. Families traveled, knowing they might have to bury their own before the journey's end, sometimes digging graves with hands raw from work, lowering their loved ones into the earth before walking on. Think about that. 6 months of relentless struggle, with death always a whisper away. Before we continue deeper into this shadowed road, I want to pause for a moment. If you've stayed with me so far, if the weight of this history has gripped you, I invite you to join our journey here. Subscribe to this channel, not just to hear stories, but to walk alongside forgotten voices, to witness the past in all its brutal honesty. Together, we keep their memory alive, because the next truths are darker still. If you thought disease and hunger were the worst fates, wait until you hear the rest. The prairie was not empty. It was alive with nations who had walked it long before wagons scarred the earth. Encounters with Native Americans are often portrayed as endless bloodshed in movies. Wagons circled against waves of attackers. The truth was more complex, more unsettling. Violence did happen, yes, but it was rare compared to the far greater threats of disease and accident. More often, pioneers traded with Native Americans, accepted their guidance, sometimes their mercy, but arrogance and ignorance often poisoned these fragile exchanges. A thoughtless insult, a stolen horse, a bullet fired in pride or panic, and the consequences could ripple out, bringing retaliation not to the guilty, but to the next train that passed through. The land was not empty. It was contested, sacred, and every wagon creak echoed in that tension. And even if you survived all of this, time, terrain, disease, encounters, you might still face the cruelest irony of all. Arrival was not salvation. Some staggered into Oregon or California, starving, sick, their wagons broken, their savings gone. The promised land offered no immediate relief, only more hardship, more uncertainty. Imagine walking 6 months into a dream, only to find nothing waiting for you but more hunger. The Oregon Trail, the journey west, was not a road to glory. It was a crucible, a grinding wheel that stripped away illusions and demanded blood, sweat, and sacrifice. And we've only scratched the surface. Because the trail hides one more secret, one that no wagon train could ever escape, a truth as merciless as the prairie wind. And that truth awaits us in the next part of our journey. That truth, as merciless as the prairie wind, was this: not everyone was meant to survive, and those who did often carried wounds far deeper than flesh. The Oregon Trail did not just kill, it changed people. It stripped away layers of civility, carved human beings down to their rawest instincts, and revealed what desperation could make of even the gentlest heart. Families who had begun their journey with laughter and hymns ended it with hollow stares, their bonds fractured, their souls weathered. Survival was not noble. Survival was sometimes cruel. Consider the children. The trail was hardest on them, not only because of fragile bodies, but because of the silence their deaths demanded. Disease struck without warning: cholera, diphtheria, fevers that burned through tiny frames in hours. A child might wake with a cough and be gone before sunset, and there was no time to grieve. The wagon train could not wait. Mothers and fathers dug shallow graves with bleeding hands, laid their children down, and walked on. Imagine leaving your son or daughter behind in the endless prairie, marked only by a crude wooden cross, or perhaps nothing at all. Imagine hearing wolves howl that night, knowing what they meant. That pain did not vanish. It lived in the eyes of every survivor. And when food ran low, hunger twisted love into something darker. Families rationed scraps, so thin they barely counted as meals. Children cried into the night, while parents pretended to sleep, their own stomachs gnawing. There were choices to make, always choices. Do you save the last biscuit for your son, or your ox, without whom the rest of you cannot continue? Do you abandon the grandmother who cannot walk another mile? Or do you risk the entire family falling behind? These were not choices at all. They were slow executions written into the trail itself. Isolation only deepened the cruelty. The prairie was vast, and sometimes wagons fell behind. A wheel broken, an ox collapsed, a child too sick to move. In those moments, the train pressed forward. To stop was to doom dozens for the sake of a few, and so families were left. A lone wagon in a sea of grass, its occupants staring into the horizon, praying for a miracle that rarely came. To be left behind was to know your days were counted not in weeks, but in hours. But the darkest truths whispered at the edge of the firelight. Winters came early, rivers froze, snow buried the trail, and wagons ground to a halt. Starvation did not knock politely. It stalked them, step by step, until the unthinkable became reality. The history books often bury this, but whispers of cannibalism are part of the trail's shadow. Not every train faced it, but enough did that the stories lingered. Flesh, once sacred, became fuel for survival, and those who partook carried not relief, but shame, a silence that followed them into the promised land. They had survived, yes, but at a cost no prayer could cleanse. It wasn't only nature or hunger that threatened. Human cruelty walked the trail too. Theft was common. Wagons raided in the night, livestock stolen, supplies vanished. Sometimes the thieves were strangers, sometimes they were neighbors. Men who had once shaken hands in brotherhood now turned on one another under the weight of desperation. A single stolen ox could doom an entire family. And when justice was sought, it was swift and brutal. Lynchings, executions by firing line, bodies left as warnings to others. Law was a thin rope, stretched across a wilderness that did not care. Even faith was tested. Many left with hymns on their lips, with Bibles packed carefully in their wagons. By the end, prayers often gave way to silence. Some cursed God, others clung harder to the belief that suffering was a divine trial. But the land was indifferent to faith. Lightning struck the devout and the faithless alike. Disease spared neither the prayerful nor the skeptical. And so, faith often bent beneath the strain or broke entirely. Think, too, of the women. They carried burdens unseen, birthing children in the wilderness with no midwife, no medicine, no sanctuary, but a rattling wagon. Many gave birth beside the trail, their cries drowned by the wind, their newborns struggling to live their first hours in dust and dirt. Some mothers did not survive those births. Their graves dotted the prairie, small mounds that told stories no one wanted to hear. Those who lived endured endless labor, cooking, mending, nursing, all while walking mile after mile. Their resilience was legendary, but it was resilience born of necessity, not choice. And yet, despite all this, the wagons kept rolling. Hope is a stubborn thing. Each sunrise carried a whisper. Maybe today will be better. Maybe the mountains will ease, the rivers will part, the sky will show mercy. Families clung to that hope, even as their numbers dwindled, even as the graves multiplied, because to let go of hope was to let go of life itself. But here is the cruelest irony of all. Arrival did not erase the suffering. Many staggered into Oregon or California, broken, penniless, with little more than scars to show for their ordeal. Land was not waiting, not in abundance. Jobs were scarce, promises exaggerated. Some found themselves as poor and desperate as when they had begun, only now carrying the ghosts of those left behind. Survival was not triumph, it was trauma with no end. Imagine a man standing on a California hillside, gazing over golden fields that had cost him his wife, 2 children, and his faith. Does he feel victory, or does he hear the rattling wheels, smell the bitter smoke of cow dung fires, see the shallow graves stretching behind him across 2,000 miles? For many, the answer was both. They lived, but they never truly escaped the trail. That is the brutal truth of the wagon westward, not the painted romance of Hollywood, not the cheerful myths of adventure, but a gauntlet of suffering that tested every human bond and often broke them. The land itself demanded a price, and it collected without mercy. And perhaps that is why these stories haunt us still, because the trail was not just a road carved across the plains, it was a mirror, showing us what humans become when stripped of comfort, when pressed against the edge of survival. Some rose with quiet heroism, others fell into darkness. Most carried both within them, side by side, until the end of their days. So the next time you see the image of a white-topped wagon rolling across the prairie, remember the truth behind that canvas. Remember the endless miles of dust, the hunger, the disease, the graves left unmarked. Remember the silence of those who survived, not because they found glory, but because the memories were too heavy to speak. And remember this final truth. The trail did not end when the wagons stopped. It lived on inside the hearts of those who walked it, a shadow they carried forever. Because sometimes survival itself is the most haunting story of all.